Okay, so we've got our render mixed, we've got everything ready to go. Now I'm going to show you in in-depth detail on how to apply your scratch coat. And first thing to think about, all the beads are set out. The first thing I want to say is you've got to make sure your render is lower than the height of your beads. Obviously we've got a scratch coat, the first coat. On top of this we need to have the finish coat, which lines up in line with the beads. So make sure you're behind the beads when you're rendering. And as you can see, I'm starting from the edges first, pushing my render deep into the mesh. You've got to make sure them beads are tight, and when the render sets, you've got a nice hold on your beads. You don't want them moving when it comes to the finish coat, so make sure you push into the edges of your beads, make sure everything's tight. And the other thing to consider is when you're applying render, you need to put a lot of pressure onto the onto your trowel. So basically you've got to push the render really hard into the block. It looks like I'm being a bit retarded when I'm applying it, but it's actually because I'm putting a lot of pressure, pushing the render into the wall, and it just gives it a true grab then. You want to be spraying your background first, or if it's old brickwork that's been hacked off, priming it with SBR. But you want to make sure that you've got a bit of moisture there, so your render's got something to grip to, it can hold on to it, otherwise it'll just dry out too fast and it'll go drummy. So spray your walls down and apply your render nice and tight. As you can see, I'm pushing in hard, but the other thing to do is don't play with your render. Once you've got it on, don't matter if it's a bit wavy, it doesn't matter if it's not perfectly flat, but don't play with it. Because what you do, the trowel will pull the moisture from the back of the render, and it'll actually make the render lose grip to the blockwork. You just need to apply your render and leave it like that. I'm not playing with it now, I'm not going back to the beginning. You might see me do it once or twice, but that's it. Don't keep troweling your render. Put it on, as I'm doing there. Put it on nice and tight. Work from the tops. Maybe give it one smooth down. And that's it. Don't play with it. Trust me. We've had it before where walls have gone drummy because it's just been over troweled way too much. Flatten it a little bit in sections as one, but yeah, don't worry too much. Like I said, just make sure your render's not poking higher than the beads. So maybe when you've applied it, just run a straight edge from bead to bead and make sure the scratch coat is behind that area. So next bit is just making sure we've got it scratched. Simple process. All you do is use this little tool, it's actually called a scratcher, and you just use the scratcher to run lines through your render. Do it whilst it's wet, don't wait for it to dry. So I've literally just applied this section here. Obviously this is a different wall, different situation. And actually throughout this whole tutorial I'm going to be going through different scenarios just so you've got different examples. But all you do is literally just scratch some lines into the render. And the reason we're doing this is so when you apply your top coat, it's got something to grip to. If you don't do this, your top coat render will literally just slide off the wall and it'll be a nightmare. So just scratch it in. Don't go too deep, yet don't go too shallow. As you can see from the video, you want enough of a depth so the render can stick to, but not too deep so you're actually touching the underside of the brick. That'll compromise the strength of the render. It's not good, you just want a nice depth, and just so the top coat can stick to it. So this is easy to do, and as you can see, very easy process. So what I do now is I've waited a day. I often wait a day once I've applied my first coat, applied my scratch coat, sorry. And then when it comes to applying your top coat, I usually wait a day to get this on. In the first video you see me apply the render from the left. Now what people actually recommend, and a lot of the old school plasterers, when you're rendering, you work the opposite direction, which is right to left instead of left to right, as if you were skimming. I'm going to follow that now, just to give you another idea. And I'm working top down, again working from the right side of the bead, working to the left. And then basically just, again, doing the same thing as what I taught in the last section, which is plying. Just want to keep firm pressure when you're putting a render to the wall. Push it in nice and tight. Make sure it's getting in the grooves where the scratch coat is, and make sure it's getting a real good grip to the first coat of render. So as you can see, I'm holding my hawk underneath as well, so if anything does fall, you know, I'll catch it. A bit more efficient on your usage of render, not too much dropping. But yeah, basically just load it up. We're just doing the exact same thing. Pushing in hard, working to the render lines, and just making sure that when you're doing it, you're trying to keep a firm pressure all the way. I have actually wetted the scratch coat as well before I did this, give it a light spray with some water. And again, for the same reason as what we said before, it just gives a real good grip to the render. If it's too dry, it won't have that as a good a connection as if it had a bit of moisture to it. You always want a bit of moisture before you apply your render, but you don't drench it. If you put too much water, when it comes to ruling off, which is what I'll show you in a minute, you'll just pull the render, it'll be too wet, it'll just drag away from the scratch coat. You just want a light haze before you start rendering. Nothing too major, don't splits it with like a pressure washer or anything. Just put a nice light haze of water and then you'll be good to go. So as you can see, keep working right to the left, and the reason with that is they say that it's easier to get a gauge on the thickness throughout working that way. I actually can't tell a difference, but give it a go. Notice for yourself. This is just what a lot of the old school plasterers will tell you to do. Work right to left. Again, I don't really see the difference, to be fair, but each to their own. Try both ways, see what's best for you. So again, the other thing is what I like to do is I actually like to apply my render slightly thicker and slightly higher than the beads. And there's a reason for that, which I'll show you in a minute. But basically when it comes to ruling off, which is where we're getting the render flat, that way we don't have to keep applying render. If it's too low, you'll rule it off and you won't have enough to get, and you'll just keep reapplying, keep reusing the render. So I actually apply this coat slightly thicker than the beads, where it's the opposite. When the scratch coat, you want it lower the beads. On this, I actually apply it thicker and put more render on than I need. It's easier for this part, which is ruling the render, which is what I'll show you right now. What I've got there is a feather edge, nice piece of kit. So I find it a lot easier to use than a standard straight edge. And for this is well easy. Because you've got bead to bead, literally push the straight edge to each end of the bead. Make sure you're getting a nice tight coat, and you literally just drag or rule the render off of the wall. Simple process if you've got bead either side. Not much to really get wrong here. You're literally just pushing the rule to the render and you're just dragging the excess render off. That way it gives you a cleaner, gives you this, what gives you your flat wall. You won't get it with your trowel. Again, it's not like plastering. This is a totally different game. We're using a straight edge to get our walls nice and flat. So like you can see, any excess, just use your bucket trowel, scrape it away, scrape it down back into your bucket. That can be reused again, don't worry about that. It's good to go. It'll be slightly thicker, but again, it doesn't really matter. And then what I do now, give it one more rule off, and now I'm pushing right into the beads, making sure that I'm getting the most from it. That's an easy example. In the next clip, I'm going to go into a bit more deal using a straight edge and a different scenario. And just a quick side note, if you check the link underneath, if you want to get into the actual world of plastering and rendering, if you sign up to the link below or click it, it'll take you to a page where it'll give you a full plastering course free of charge. And literally just go to a website, you'll get free videos, free how-to videos, and just free examples on how you can start learning the finished plastering side. So after this video, if you find this useful and you want to carry it on further, click the link below, sign up to our free welcome course, which is all about finished plastering. But for now, let's get back to the render. And basically, what you do is you rule the render off using it. So you place it flat on the wall, working from your bead, and you rule the render off. You literally look, as you can see, I'm actually taking it off the wall. So remember in the last video I said I like to leave it slightly proud. That's so you don't have to fill any sections in. So as you can see, the majority of that is ruled off quite nicely. And what you'll notice now is I'm going from the next point. What I'm doing is I'm following from the last point before. So now you can see, as I've worked from that flat area to the left, I'm using my straight edge now to follow that line all the way through. And we want to keep working back on ourselves. So the first starting point was a bead. Now I've worked on from the last section that I've just flattened. Now I'm going to work to the end, to the last bead. As you can see, the beads on the other end, it's quite far on the screen, but that's my finish point. So now I've got to make sure all these meet and it makes sure that it's nice and flat running all the way through. And I must admit, there's quite a knack to this. It does take some getting used to. It's not as easy as it looks, but with practice, you know, this can be something you aim for. You've just got to get knack of using the feather edge. As you can see there, you can see where there's low sections. That's where there's not enough render where I flattened it. So now what I'm going to do is going to fill in them low sections. Get your render on a hawk, and then you don't have to be fussy about this. Again, as you can see now, I'm gonna add a lot more on than what you need. Look, there you go. I'm adding quite a lot on. You can see that. I'm not being stingy. I'm not trying to do it with my trowel. You literally put it on where you need it, and then you rule it back off again. We're not going to use a trowel. Like I said, it's not like plastering. We're not going to get it flat with a trowel. You use your feather edge. So work where you were, pull it off again. Now you can see that whole area is covered. I've got a little bit. That's a trick. If you ever want to try it, try and put it back on with your derby, but there you go. So that whole section now has been flattened off. You can see it. But now I make a bit of a mistake. Can you see that? Where all them ripples are? That's where I've tried to keep spreading it when the render was still on. And what you've done is it catches the render and forces the straight edge to ripple. That's why you should always clean your feather edge in between everything you're doing. So now watch, I'm going to flatten it again, try and get rid of them ripples. Nice and flat, pull it up. There you go, always work into your beads. Always, so I've got the bead to the side, bead at the top. Make sure you haven't got any render peeling over. You want it to be nice and crisp on that corner and on the bead. So then you get a nice clean return and a nice clean corner. So same again, I'm just filling all the sections that I need some more render on. There you go, I'm just putting it on. Again, I'm putting loads on. I don't want to keep applying render, keep going back and forth. Whack it on and then use your feather edge to peel it off. And that's how you do it really. Again, I'm always cleaning my feather edge, always. As you can see, just come straight up, take it back. Nice, job done. There you go, put it back on with your derby if you can. That takes a bit of time to do that, so I won't try that straight away. But again, just get used to having the knack of using the feather edge, or whichever straight edge you're using. You know, there's so many out there. There's H frames, there's serrated ones. I just like the feather edge. I find it's nicer to use, and it's just it's a nice way of flattening your render. And as you can see, as soon as I'm putting the render on, I'm flattening it off again. I'm not waiting. I don't want the render to go hard. It's not good. Then it pulls. You start getting a lot of drag marks. I pretty much, the way I flatten it is I've laid on that side section, so it's not a big area, put on a second coat. As soon as I've laid it on, I'm going back to the beginning with my feather edge and ruling it off. I don't wait. I don't like to wait for the render to go hard. I want to do it whilst it's still wet. It's easier to rule off, it's easier to pull, it doesn't leave as many drag marks, and it's a lot easier to work with. So what I recommend is you apply your second coat, apply a section, like not a huge area, but a big enough area to work with, and then rule it off straight away. Don't wait, because it's just going to cause problems, and if you wait too long, it will drag, and before you know it, your render will be pulling, there'll be lines everywhere, and you'll just struggle to get it flat. So apply a section with your second coat, put it on, and then by the time you've come to the end, go back to the beginning and rule it off. As you can see, I'm just filling in the sections where I need it and then ruling it off straight away. What I'm doing here is I'm getting a bit of render, filling any sections where I need it. Basically, you just want to make sure that whole area looks like it's been ruled. You can see where it hasn't because it looks smooth. But look, I'm going to show you something here. I'm going to pick you up and take you away. There's a little section here. You see that? You get stones in your mix sometimes. Pull it out. And then, some stones will drag all the way up your wall. Pull it out, fill it in. Don't make a big deal out of it. You don't have to go over that with the rule again. Just fill it in with your trowel. And then just check. See, there's a line here. There's a line that runs all the way through. Get a bit of render. Try and smooth it off. And then that's it. Don't use your trowel though everywhere. I've only done that because there was a line. Leave it as it is. Leave it serrated. And the next section is when we start getting it nice and flat. But for now, I'll leave it like that. We want the oxygen to get to the render, and we want it to dry, because we won't be able to float until this starts getting hard. So we want the oxygen to hit, we want the oxidation to happen, and that's the reaction that forces the render to dry. So leave it like this. Winner. Okay, now we're on to the final section. This is where we start getting the wall looking nice, cushy. It's looking like a real job. What you've got to do is wait for the render to dry slightly, and you've got to literally wait for it to go touch dry. And what I've got there, this is called a float. And what I'm doing is I'm rubbing the wall up in small circular motions, and what this does is it closes in any gaps, any high spots on the render. You're literally pulling away with your float, and what happens, it fills in any areas that hasn't got any render there. So it takes the high spots away and fills the render where you've got low spots, so there's not enough in sections. And as you can see, it actually closes in the aggregate as well. So after using the rule, you've noticed that it leaves quite a rough texture. This flow basically closes them gaps in and starts making your wall look a lot more uniformed in consistency, uniform texture. And the idea is you keep the float flat to the wall and you literally rub it in circular motions. And if you work into your beads, work away from the beads, so actually push the render into the corners, and that way you're going to close your beads up, you're going to get a nicer finish on your edges. What you can see there, I've actually took a bit of wet render that I've used, and I'm actually filling in any gaps where it's looking really low. And what you do is you literally take it, put it onto the sections that needs it, and rub it back in. That's how you fill in any major holes or any areas that are really low. Take the wet render, put it in there, and rub it in place. You know, make sure it's slightly wet, you don't want it too dry, but basically when you put it in, it's so much easier to float in and fill in any sections that are, you know, very low behind. And what you can see is I'm actually trying to float into the section above. What I do is I work in sections, float an area. The area above I've had to get onto ladders because it's quite a high platform. And what I'm using there is a water sprayer. It's a very hot day when I was doing this. So what I'm doing is I'm spraying the render, and as you can see, when you float it back up, it's almost like it livens up again. See, it comes back to life if you just give it a bit of water, and it's so much easier to float if you just give it a little spray. Don't be shy, you know. Put it on there, just give it a little drench. Don't make sure you don't put too much water on because you can actually overdo it. And give it a little spray if it's dry, float it up, and you'll find that it closes in a lot better that way. Now this is the finished section. I'll give you a quick rundown, but in a minute I'll show you a proper reason. But I've floated up, and what I'm doing is I'm getting my sponge, and you literally hold it very lightly and gently rub the render. And what this does, it brings the aggregate to the surface, and it gives it that traditional finish of sand cement. I'll show you a proper demo in a minute, but what's happened is I've noticed that there's been a little lump, or there's a little gap where there's a hollow in the render. Take some of your wet render, fill it in, and then get back on this float it up, and then get your sponge and then do it again. And what you're doing is just lightly gripping it. You're not taking a hold, you're not doing it firm. You're literally just lightly holding the sponge and rubbing it into little circle motions, giving you that finish that you're after. You know, the lighter you are, the less lines you'll have showing. And you're literally just rubbing it up very gently, a little bit of moisture on your sponge, and then there you go. I'll show you more on that in a minute. I'm just going to go back into the floating side. You'll notice that on the beads to the right, there's quite a few sections where there's not enough render. Basically, what you're going to have to do is just fill in them patches with some of the wet render. So always have some render left over in a bucket. Always have it to your side. And just always work with it. And just make sure you clean your beads up as you're going. I've just done that there because it's just so much easier when it comes to doing reveals. Obviously I won't be doing the reveals until the doors are in. That's up to the builder, nothing to do with me. When he wants me back, I'll finish it up. But for now, all we're doing is just this front. And as you can see, I'm just wetting the render back up again, just to give it that extra bit of moisture and encouragement to liven it up again. Otherwise you'll be pulling it. When you float it, it's almost like the sand is really coarse and it doesn't want to rub up. If you give it a bit of moisture, it just makes the job 1,000 times easier. And as you can see with the beads, push the render to the outside of the beads and force any excess into the gaps. You don't want any gaps on your beads. You want your beads and your corners to be bang on. You want the crisp corners. And that comes down to your ruling as well. Again, back to the ruling off. If you haven't ruled off properly, then you'll notice that the render might be slightly higher than the beads. That's not what you want. You want nice, tight returns, nice tight corner, and that comes down to make sure you've ruled off tightly to your beads when you did it. So as you can see, just a bit more now, a bit more render to fill in, and just literally just rub it into place. One of the biggest things of floating is making sure you catch it at the right time. I'd prefer it to be slightly drier than slightly wetter. If it's too wet, you're just going to do damage to your wall. You'll end up taking more render off and actually be detrimental. Whereas if you coat it when it's slightly dry, at least you can spray it up and bring it back to life in that sense. So that's that. Again, rubbing it up, rubbing the whole area, make sure everything's filled, and just pretty much making sure that the whole area is nice, floated, flat. And you're just really focusing in. And that's called a figure of 8, what I'm doing there. That's one thing that a lot of floating, people who do the floating, we did a lot of that in New Zealand. Figure of 8, make sure that you've got a flatter background, you're working on a bigger area when you're using the float. And I just find sometimes it gives a lot better finish using that rather than traditional circular motions. But both are fine, whatever you're happy doing. But as you can see, again, I'm moving the float to the outside of the beads, forcing that render into the edges, just making sure that we've not missed anything. It's all looking nice, crisp, and ready to go. So that's that. Make sure you're just focusing on catching all the render, closing in all the gaps, and you just make sure, this is what makes your wall flat, as well as looking nice and smooth, but this is what makes your wall flat. The other thing to consider is I've got a brick vent here. I'm not going to show you how to cut it out. I didn't actually have footage of it, which is stupid, but what you do is you just render further than what you need, float it up, sponge it, and when it's all done, what I usually try and do is keep a spare vent, offer it up, and you literally just cut around the render and cut it out. That way it gives you the perfect opening for what the event would look like, and it gives a nice finish. It's a lot nicer than trying to render around it. I just like to cut the render when it's all done, and it gives you a lovely, nice, crisp finish and a nice return. So that's all floated. As you can see, that's the section we're going to do. Now we're going to get the sponge. I like to sponge it twice, so I do it once with a wet sponge. Not wet, I don't mean wet at all, but it's slightly damp. And I just give it a nice little rub. And this fills in any gaps that's been left behind and allows the render to start taking shape. What I do is I go over it once like this, a rough. Again, you want to hold it quite lightly. The firmer you are with the sponge, the rougher it's going to look in terms of finish. It's going to leave little lines behind. We used to call them rat tails. The lighter you are, the better. And always keep your sponge clean. If you've got excess render on it, take your sponge, and then what you do is really wring it out. Always keep your sponge clean. That's another thing you've got to be aware of when you're sponging up. Don't keep a dirty sponge. Make sure it's always cleaned. And again, just lightly rub the render, and what it'll do, it'll bring the sand to the surface and give it a look, and it'll give the aggregate, make sure it comes to the surface of the render. And that's it. So basically, lightly sponge it up, and I've gone over it all once now. Now, on the second time I sponge it, really wring the sponge out and try and get all the water off now. As you can see, really take it off, dry it up, and even hit it on the side to get any excess off as well. Now the second time, I always like my sponge to be nice and dry, not even damp. This just really closes in the gaps, brings the aggregate to the surface, and it gives it a nice flat texture. I think the second time round definitely have the sponge drier than wet. Just further finish, I find it gives better results, and I just find that it's always a lot easier that way. If your sponge is too wet, you're just going to liven the render back up again, and you'll just have to float it. The drier the better. And it also prevents the render from sticking to the sponge. So that's that. Keep a light grip, don't hold it tight, and just let the sponge do the work. Gently rub the wall up, and then what you'll see is you should be left with a lovely finish if you've floated it up. I think the magic is in the floating, really. That's where the important part is. The sponging is generally quite easy. The floating, what can be a bit tricky. But other than that, you're all good to go. As you can see, nice rendered wall. It's looking good. Obviously, just carry around to the rest of it, and then you've done it. So that's the full video series. That's how you render a wall. If you liked it, please press like, and if you like the videos, please subscribe. That's what keeps us going. I appreciate you watching it, and as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon on the next one. Cheers. Playing great. See you later. Bye.